I always thought I had the perfect life. My name is Claire Thompson, and by all outward appearances, I was living a dream. A beautiful home in a quiet suburban neighborhood, a husband who seemed charming and successful, and a life that, to anyone looking in, seemed flawless. But appearances are tricky. They can hide the sharpest knives. When I first met Daniel, I thought I'd found my person. He had this easy smile, the kind that makes you feel like the world has finally aligned in your favor. Everyone loved him, his friends, his family, even strangers. He had a way of making you feel special, like you were the only one who truly mattered. I, however, was blissfully unaware of the cracks that lay beneath that polished exterior. I've always been careful, thoughtful, and meticulous. I notice the small things, the way someone avoids eye contact when they're lying, the way a laugh can mask tension. And in the beginning, I ignored those tiny signals because I wanted to believe in us. I wanted to believe in love. Daniel came from money, though not as much as his parents, who were the real rulers of the Thompson estate. His mother, Eleanor, is the kind of woman who smiles with her lips but cuts with her words. I first met her at a Sunday brunch when Daniel and I had been dating only 6 months. She gave me a look I'll never forget, half curiosity, half judgment. She asked me where I worked, what I made, where I came from, and when I hesitated even slightly, her smile faltered. That was the first time I felt the chill of her presence. Daniel, of course, brushed it off. "Mom's just protective," he said, and I wanted to believe that too. I convinced myself that everything was fine because at home it was. Or so I thought. Our first year of marriage was like a fairy tale. We decorated our home together, laughed over wine in the kitchen, and dreamed about the future. But somewhere between the laughter and the picture-perfect nights, I started noticing subtle changes. The way Daniel would check his phone when I wasn't looking, the way Eleanor would comment on my frivolous spending at family gatherings, the way Daniel's friends would smirk when I mentioned my modest savings or my career ambitions. I brushed it off. I wanted to be a good wife. I told myself that love meant sacrifice, that being patient and understanding was my way of keeping the peace. But peace, as I would soon learn, is only a mask for the chaos that's waiting to explode. The cracks grew slowly, almost imperceptibly. Eleanor would invite me to family events, but constantly point out how my choices didn't fit into the Thompson lifestyle. My clothing, my small gestures, even the way I laughed, it was all wrong in her eyes. Daniel, when confronted, would apologize, but never defend me. I began to notice that every compromise I made, every attempt I made to fit in, was somehow twisted into proof that I wasn't good enough. At first, I doubted myself. Maybe I was imagining it. Maybe I was too sensitive. But then came the moments I could no longer ignore. I remember standing in the kitchen one evening folding laundry when Daniel came in with a grin and said casually, "Mom says she doesn't think you'll ever really belong here. She hopes we don't waste too much time." I froze. The words hit me like a cold slap. I wanted to cry, to yell, to run away, but I just nodded silently, pretending I hadn't heard. That was the first time I truly felt unwelcome in my own marriage. Even then, I still held on to hope. I still tried to see the best in Daniel. I told myself that deep down, he loved me, that he would never intentionally hurt me. But life has a cruel way of revealing truths when you least expect it. And then there was the money. Daniel's obsession with wealth started small, a comment here, a slight criticism there, but it grew. He would question every purchase I made, every plan I suggested. Even vacations became a competition, a way to flaunt his family's fortune. Slowly, I began to realize that love was no longer the priority. Money was. And not just money, but control over it. Control over me, my life, my future. I tried to talk to him to explain how his words and actions made me feel, but he always had a reason, a justification, a way to make me feel guilty for even questioning him. I began to feel trapped like a character in someone else's story. I wanted to scream, but every time I did, I was reminded how carefully Daniel had built this world, one where I appeared to be the lucky, happy wife, while he quietly measured every aspect of my life, calculating my weaknesses. I didn't realize then that these small moments were the first steps leading me to a truth I wasn't ready to face. The truth that the life I thought I had built with love and trust was nothing more than a carefully constructed illusion, and that illusion was about to shatter completely. It all happened so suddenly, and yet, looking back, I can see how every little warning sign had led to that moment. Daniel sat across from me at the breakfast table one Saturday morning, his usual confident smile plastered on his face. But there was a coldness in his eyes I hadn't seen before, a sharp edge that made my stomach twist. He said, "I think we need to talk," casually, like he was about to discuss the weather. I smiled nervously. "Okay, about what?" He leaned back, took a sip of his coffee, and looked at me as if he was seeing me for the first time. "Claire, I think it's time we go our separate ways." For a split second, I thought I hadn't heard him correctly. I laughed, trying to brush it off as a joke. "You mean a divorce?" "Yes," he said simply. "I've thought about this a lot, and I can't do this anymore. I can't stay married to someone who doesn't fit in with our life. Our priorities are different." My chest tightened. I couldn't breathe. The words sounded like a punch to the gut. My mind raced, trying to understand how the man that I had loved, the man that I had trusted completely, could just say this as if it was nothing. "Different priorities?" I whispered, my voice shaking. "Are you serious? After everything we've been through?" He shrugged. "I've tried to make it work, Claire, but I can't. I want someone who understands what's important, who can keep up with this lifestyle." He gestured vaguely around the kitchen, as if the walls themselves could attest to his point. I felt my hands tremble. "So, all this time, it wasn't enough. Was it my job, my savings? Me?" He avoided my gaze. "It's not just you, it's everything. I think it's better if we end this before it gets worse." I wanted to scream, to beg, to cry, but the words stuck in my throat. My world was unraveling in front of me, and I didn't even know how to stop it. For months, I had tried to be perfect, to fit in with his family, to be the ideal wife. And now, in an instant, it had all been thrown away, discarded as if it never mattered. That day, I left the house in a daze. I couldn't stay there. I couldn't face the smug look on Eleanor's face when she learned the news. I drove aimlessly, my hands gripping the steering wheel, replaying Daniel's words over and over in my head. "Different priorities, doesn't fit in, better if we end this." Every phrase felt like a nail being hammered into the coffin of my marriage. Over the next few days, reality hit harder. Daniel began moving things out of the house, making arrangements with lawyers, signing papers I didn't fully understand. He claimed it was for both of us, but I could feel the cold precision behind his actions. Every decision he made seemed calculated to hurt me, to take control of what he believed was his. And then there was Eleanor. Oh, Eleanor. I realized just how much she had been working behind the scenes. Every smile she gave me at family events had been a mask. Every casual comment about my spending, my career, my lack of understanding of the Thompson lifestyle, it was all preparation. She wanted me gone. And Daniel had handed her the perfect opportunity. I felt utterly alone. My friends tried to comfort me, but they didn't understand the layers of betrayal. They didn't know that this wasn't just a divorce. This was a meticulously planned act aimed at stripping me of my dignity, my home, and eventually my financial security. In the middle of this heartbreak, I discovered something even worse. Daniel had already been speaking to someone else, a woman he called understanding and perfect for the life I want. The realization cut deeper than any argument, any insult. He wasn't just leaving me, he was replacing me. And the way he smiled while doing it, so confident, so sure of himself, made my blood boil. But something inside me shifted that day. Something quiet, something dangerous. The shock, the hurt, the betrayal, it didn't crush me. It awakened a side of me I hadn't known existed. A side that realized I wasn't powerless, that I had been underestimated. And if Daniel thought he could discard me so easily, he was about to learn just how wrong he had been. I spent weeks watching, listening, learning. Every word Daniel said, every move he made, every interaction with his family, it was all fuel. I started taking notes, saving emails, keeping track of accounts. I realized he had made one critical mistake. He assumed I was naive, that I would crumble quietly and disappear. But I was neither naive nor weak. And as I began quietly building my plan, I understood the cruelest truth about love and betrayal. Sometimes the very people who destroy you unknowingly teach you how to become unstoppable. The weeks after the divorce announcement were the darkest of my life, yet also the most illuminating. I stayed in the house that had once been my sanctuary, but now felt like a gilded cage. Every corner seemed to whisper reminders of how easily I had been discarded. Daniel moved with a casual arrogance, like nothing had changed, while Eleanor watched from the sidelines, her smirk barely contained. It was during one of those long, sleepless nights that I started noticing things. Small discrepancies in bank statements, unusual transfers, odd conversations Daniel left open on his phone. At first, I thought I was imagining patterns where there were none. But as days went by, a horrifying picture began to emerge. Daniel hadn't just decided to leave me. He had been planning this for months, maybe years. Every investment, every asset, every promise he had made had a hidden agenda. And Eleanor knew. She had orchestrated much of it behind a polished smile and the guise of concern. I remember sitting at my dining table that night, laptop open, paper spread across every inch of space, heart pounding, staring at numbers and emails I could hardly believe were real. Daniel had underestimated me in the biggest possible way. He thought my grief and shock would render me helpless. He was wrong. That was when I made a decision. I would not let him or his family destroy me. But I wouldn't do it rashly. Revenge, I realized, needed strategy, precision, patience. I couldn't just lash out emotionally. I had to dismantle everything he thought was untouchable, piece by piece. The first step was information. I began tracking his assets, digging into the accounts he thought I didn't understand. I monitored his meetings, noticed the patterns of his investments, and even paid attention to his casual boasts at family dinners. Every detail became a weapon. Next, I started building allies. I reached out quietly to people Daniel had overlooked, lawyers, accountants, even his business associates. Those who knew the truth but had remained silent because they underestimated my resolve. I framed my questions carefully. appearing meek and still emotionally fragile while gathering evidence. Every conversation, every casual remark became another thread I could pull. Then came the cruelest revelation. Daniel had been planning to introduce his new partner, a woman he called perfect, into every facet of his life. What he didn't know was that she wasn't as loyal to him as he believed. With subtle persuasion and careful framing, I began nudging her towards realizing just how much Daniel's arrogance had cost her, how easily she could be replaced, and how dangerous his manipulation was. Slowly, unknowingly, she became an unwitting ally in my plan. Meanwhile, Daniel and Eleanor continued their performances. Daniel flaunted his new freedom and confidence, convinced that I had been broken and silent. Eleanor assumed her victory was complete. And all the while, I observed, calculated, patient, invisible. I won't lie. It was painful. Watching the life I had dreamed of being stripped away was like being submerged in ice-cold water. But beneath that pain grew a fierce determination. Every insult, every dismissive glance, every casual word of betrayal fueled a fire I hadn't known existed. I started planning methodically. First, subtle social exposure. Daniel was cocky, believing he could win every conversation in every room. But small whispers, carefully placed facts about his financial missteps and his inability to truly manage his assets began to spread. Quietly. No one could trace them to me, but the effects were undeniable. People began noticing cracks in the facade of his perfect life. Then came the next phase, financial precision. Daniel had counted on my shock and grief to make me passive. He hadn't considered that I had both the intellect and the patience to turn his own strategies against him. Every account he tried to manipulate, every transfer he believed would go unnoticed, I monitored. I didn't act recklessly. I acted like water, feeling every crack, silent but unstoppable. I began to understand something else too. Revenge wasn't just about proving him wrong. It was about reclaiming the person I had been when I was strong, before the marriage and family pressures had chipped away at my confidence. It was about showing myself that I could survive betrayal and emerge not just intact, but victorious. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, I started to feel the shift. The fear and pain began to be replaced by a cold, determined clarity. I wasn't just a victim anymore. I was a strategist, a woman who had been pushed aside, yes, but who now held the power to turn the tables entirely. Little did Daniel know, the life he thought he had mastered was about to become his greatest nightmare. The first thing I did was secure my own position. I hired a lawyer discreetly, someone I could trust to understand that this wasn't just a financial dispute. It was a game of patience and strategy. I needed someone who could navigate the legal maze Daniel had set up without alarming him. Every call, every consultation was carefully hidden from him, all while maintaining the act of being emotionally shattered and indecisive. Then came the subtle infiltrations. Daniel had always been proud of his financial acumen, his ability to manipulate numbers to his advantage. I quietly began auditing shared accounts, cross-referencing transactions, and noting every irregularity. It didn't take long to realize how careless he had been, how confident in his assumptions about me. He had left traces everywhere, thinking I would never notice. I also started planting seeds in his social circles. Daniel loved to attend charity events, cocktail parties, and networking dinners, always surrounded by people eager to be impressed by his wealth and charm. I, pretending to be fragile and withdrawn, whispered concerns here and there, carefully letting others know about inconsistencies, questionable decisions, and subtle mismanagement. Nothing overt, nothing traceable, but enough to make those around him second guess him. Meanwhile, I began to study Eleanor. Her arrogance had always been a shield, and it became clear she underestimated me completely. Every comment she made at brunches or dinners, every pointed remark about my background or spending habits was carefully stored in my mind. I learned her patterns, her favorite manipulations, and how she believed she could control both Daniel and me. Every move she made became a blueprint for the ways I could turn her own strategies against her. The most difficult part, emotionally, was watching Daniel with his new partner. He flaunted her in every way possible, introducing her to friends, to business associates, to family gatherings. He believed she was perfect for his life, and in a way she was. Perfect for my plan. Slowly, I began establishing a subtle connection with her. I didn't reveal my intentions, of course, but I asked questions designed to plant doubts in her mind about Daniel's honesty, his motives, and his character. Within weeks, I could see the shift, her admiration turning into a cautious wariness. I also learned something crucial during this time. Revenge isn't about rushing, it's about precision. A rust plan leaves evidence, leaves you vulnerable. I became meticulous, tracking every email, every financial transfer, every interaction Daniel had with his family and business associates. Every piece of information became another thread I could pull when the time was right. The hardest part was controlling my emotions. I had to maintain the image of someone broken, someone devastated, while inside I was building the arsenal that would one day dismantle Daniel and Eleanor entirely. I cried alone at night, not for my marriage, but for the loss of innocence. My naive belief that love could survive in a house filled with greed, manipulation, and betrayal. But those tears, as much as they were genuine, also served a purpose. They reinforced the mask I wore in the day. Little victories came quietly. A whispered comment at a party, a minor financial adjustment I redirected without him noticing, a subtle shift in his social reputation. I watched as Daniel's confidence began to show small cracks, just the tiniest hints of uncertainty. I didn't push too hard. I let him think he was still in control. That illusion was vital. It made the eventual collapse all the more devastating. I began to feel something I hadn't expected, a cold satisfaction, not the cruel, gloating type, but a calm, centered power. I was no longer just a victim. I was a strategist, a player in a game that Daniel had foolishly assumed he could win without consequence. Every sleepless night, every tear, every quiet observation was building toward the moment when I would strike, and when I did, nothing about him would remain untouched. It was a rainy Tuesday when I discovered the full scope of Daniel's plan. I had been quietly reviewing financial statements, tracing transactions, and comparing notes with my lawyer. At first, it seemed like minor discrepancies, slightly inflated expenses, transfers to obscure accounts, and investments that didn't make sense. But as I dug deeper, a horrifying pattern emerged. Daniel wasn't just leaving me. He was trying to erase me financially, bit by bit, while pretending to be the grieving ex. He had created shell accounts in multiple states, transferring portions of our shared assets under the guise of future investments. Eleanor had facilitated some of it, using her influence with accountants and lawyers to ensure every move appeared legitimate. The level of manipulation was staggering, and yet every detail had left traces, careless gaps that only someone observant and patient could uncover. I felt a rush of adrenaline, not fear. For the first time since the divorce announcement, I felt control.
I realized Daniel had underestimated me. He thought heartbreak would paralyze me, but in reality, it had sharpened me. The first thing I did was consolidate proof. I created detailed records of every transaction, every suspicious move, every whispered comment Eleanor had made that revealed knowledge of his schemes. I cross-checked emails, scanned invoices, and even tracked his hidden properties. By the end of the week, I had a dossier that could topple him, piece by piece, if I played it right. But I couldn't act recklessly. Daniel and Eleanor thrived on assumptions. They assumed I was emotional or rational, incapable of planning. That illusion became my shield. I continued to show vulnerability in public, soft smiles, quiet conversations with friends, even tears when the topic of our marriage arose. All the while, I was orchestrating a silent siege that no one would see coming. Then came the first calculated strike. Daniel had been boasting about a major investment at a charity gala, a project he claimed would secure his financial legacy and further impress Eleanor and the social circle they prized. I attended, dressed simply, looking fragile, as if the divorce had drained me entirely. But in my pocket, I had documents showing the investment was fraudulent, backed by questionable loans and unverified partners. I let the information leak subtly. I whispered concerns to mutual acquaintances, asked questions that planted seeds of doubt in their minds. Within weeks, the first murmurs of uncertainty began to circulate around Daniel. People who had once admired him now questioned his judgment, quietly and politely, while he remained oblivious. Meanwhile, I began approaching the new woman in his life. I didn't reveal anything directly, but I asked subtle questions designed to make her see Daniel in a new light. The inconsistencies in his stories, the way he flaunted his wealth without real accountability, the whispers of financial carelessness. Slowly, I watched her perception shift. Where at once there had been admiration and loyalty, a tiny seed of doubts began to grow. I had no doubt she would eventually see him for what he truly was, and perhaps, unknowingly, become another instrument in my plan. I also tightened control over the finances. Every account I could access, every loophole I discovered, I leveraged. I didn't act impulsively. I acted like water filling a crack, slow, almost invisible, yet unstoppable. By the time Daniel realized anything was happening, the first strands of his safety net had already frayed. But the most satisfying realization of all was Eleanor. She had spent years manipulating everyone around her, assuming her control over Daniel and his assets was absolute. And yet, in underestimating me, she had left herself exposed. Every snide remark, every judgmental glance, every subtle attempt to humiliate me became a map of her weaknesses. I knew exactly where to strike when the time came. That week, as I sat alone in my study, reviewing documents and calculating the precise steps ahead, I felt a clarity I hadn't known since before the marriage. This wasn't about anger anymore. It wasn't about tears or heartbreak. This was about power, about reclaiming what was mine and dismantling the arrogance of those who thought they could discard me without consequence.
And for the first time, I allowed myself a quiet smile. The real game was only just beginning, and I was already 3 moves ahead. The first step in my plan was subtlety. Daniel and Eleanor had made one critical mistake. They assumed I would crumble quietly, that I would fade away like a woman scorned. But I had no intention of fading. I would dismantle their world slowly, invisibly, like a shadow in the room, unnoticed until the damage was done. I began with the social circle. Daniel thrived on appearances, cocktail parties, charity galas, business networking events. His confidence and charm had always made him untouchable in these settings. I had to chip away at that perception without being seen as the instigator. I started by whispering carefully worded questions to mutual friends, planting seeds of doubt about Daniel's financial decisions. A question here: are you sure his new investment is legitimate?
A comment there. I heard there were some unusual transfers recently. Nothing overt, nothing accusatory, but people began to notice inconsistencies. It was fascinating, in a quiet, almost exhilarating way, to watch the first cracks appear. Friends who had once admired him now exchanged uncertain glances. Daniel noticed the subtle changes, but couldn't pinpoint their source. He assumed it was paranoia or coincidence, never imagining I was orchestrating it all from the shadows. Financially, I was just as meticulous. Every account I could access, every oversight he had left exposed, I quietly leveraged. I redirected small amounts, tested the boundaries of his control, and watched his confidence slowly waver. Daniel had assumed that by divorcing me, he had gained freedom. But in reality, he had only exposed his vulnerabilities. I kept a record of every transaction, every mistake, every secret account. These weren't just tools, they were weapons, waiting for the right moment. At home, Eleanor continued her subtle attacks. She criticized my clothes, my spending, even my hobbies, convinced she still had control over me. But I had already turned those attacks into a kind of intelligence gathering. Every insult revealed her priorities, her weaknesses, the areas where she assumed she was untouchable. I took careful notes, cataloging everything for later use. Daniel's new partner proved easier to influence than I expected. I never approached her as a rival or enemy. Instead, I positioned myself as someone sympathetic, a quiet confidant. I asked questions that planted doubts about Daniel's honesty and financial practices. Over time, her perception shifted. Where there was once unquestioning trust, there was now doubt and caution. And without her even realizing it, she was becoming a small but crucial part of my plan. The most satisfying part of this phase was watching Daniel's arrogance falter. He was still oblivious to my actions, still confident in his superiority. But I could see the first signs of doubt creeping in, hesitation in his gestures, slight defensiveness when others questioned him, subtle tension during conversations. Every tiny crack made the eventual collapse that much more satisfying. I also began leveraging legal avenues discreetly. My lawyer helped me identify loopholes Daniel had overlooked in asset transfers and contracts. I didn't rush. I was patient, moving like a shadow, collecting evidence and ensuring that when the time came, every move I made would be legally unassailable. At night, I worked alone in my study, reviewing documents, cross-checking financial statements, and mapping the social dynamics of everyone involved. Every detail mattered. The right word at the right time could shift perception, weaken alliances, or turn friends into allies. Daniel and Eleanor had built a world on control and arrogance, but they had left one flaw. They underestimated me. By the end of the month, subtle victories began to show. Daniel's friends hesitated before praising him. Eleanor's smirks became cautious, as if she sensed a shift but couldn't identify it. And Daniel himself, he was starting to doubt the very foundations of the world he thought he controlled. I allowed myself a quiet sense of satisfaction. I wasn't acting out of anger or spite anymore. I was executing a plan with precision, intelligence, and patience. Every move I made was deliberate, calculated, and invisible. The true power of revenge, I realized, wasn't in immediate retribution. It was in control, strategy, and the slow unraveling of arrogance. I had learned one important truth. The people who destroy you are never as careful as you are. They leave traces, make assumptions, and believe in their invincibility. And when the moment comes to strike, those traces become the map to their downfall. By now, I had learned one undeniable truth. Revenge is not about emotion, It's about timing, precision, and subtlety. Daniel and Eleanor believed they had silenced me, removed me from their carefully curated world, and ensured I would never threaten their control. They were wrong, completely wrong. The first public move was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it sent ripples through Daniel's social world. I had spent weeks gathering evidence of his financial missteps and questionable investments. At the right moment, I let select discreet friends know what I had discovered, just enough for whispers to spread, but not enough to be traced back to me. Within days, I noticed changes. Mutual friends hesitated to praise him. Business associates who had once been eager to align with him now looked uncertain. It was slow, quiet, and devastatingly effective. Meanwhile, I kept up the appearance of a fragile, broken ex-wife. In public, I cried softly when our marriage came up. I smiled sadly when Daniel bragged about his freedom at events. People believed the story they wanted to believe, that I was shattered, powerless, and no longer relevant. That facade became my shield, allowing me to manipulate without detection. I also began to exploit Eleanor's arrogance. She had spent years believing herself untouchable, always hovering behind Daniel, ready to control every decision. I started planting subtle seeds of doubt in her mind. Casual questions, offhand comments, carefully framed observations, enough to make her hesitate, to make her wonder if Daniel was as infallible as she believed. Watching her second guess herself, even slightly, was a quiet thrill I could savor. The most complicated part was Daniel's new partner. I had to play a delicate game. She could not suspect me, nor could I appear threatening. I positioned myself as someone harmless but insightful, asking questions designed to make her notice inconsistencies in Daniel's behavior and words. Slowly, I watched her start to question him. Where there was once unquestioning trust, now there was doubt. It was subtle, but it would pay off when the time came. Financially, I began to tighten the screws. Daniel had underestimated my understanding of his accounts and investments. Small, unnoticeable shifts, slight corrections in mismanaged funds, tiny leaks in his control. I manipulated them carefully. Every adjustment left no evidence that I had been involved, but the ripple effect was undeniable. Daniel began to feel the first tendrils of uncertainty, the faintest sense that something was slipping from his grasp. Then came the first major social blow. Daniel had planned a high-profile dinner with influential business associates and family friends. It was meant to cement his reputation as successful, confident, and untouchable. I attended, looking as fragile and lost as ever, while planting small, carefully phrased doubts among the guests. A question here, a casual observation there, all referencing the inconsistencies I had discovered. By the end of the evening, I noticed subtle shifts in the room. Conversations changed. Smiles were forced. Daniel's usual charm felt strained. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't explosive, but it was effective. He was starting to feel the first true consequences of his arrogance.
At home, I prepared the next stage. Eleanor's own vulnerabilities became clearer with each interaction. I documented everything, every comment, every pointed insult, every attempt to control me or Daniel. These would become vital pieces in the eventual dismantling of their lives. But the most satisfying aspect was the psychological element. Daniel and Eleanor thrived on appearances, on the belief that they were in control. I had flipped the narrative. They were no longer in control. Every smile, every casual interaction, every gesture they made was now part of my observation, my calculation, my eventual destruction plan. And as I sat alone in the quiet of my study that night, reviewing notes, financial records, and social interactions, I realized something powerful. Revenge wasn't about anger. It wasn't about shouting, threatening, or confrontation. It was about patience, observation, and strategy. It was about letting your adversaries build their empire of arrogance and then dismantling it quietly, piece by piece. And slowly, methodically, I began the next stage of the plan. The stage that would make Daniel and Eleanor realize that underestimating me had been their gravest mistake. By this point, I was no longer the grieving, fragile ex-wife. That persona had served its purpose. I was invisible to them, underestimated and dismissed. Daniel and Eleanor had no idea the storm gathering quietly around them was entirely because of me. And I was ready to turn the pressure up, strategically, mercilessly, and without leaving a trace. The first target was Daniel's business reputation. He had always been proud, flaunting his supposed acumen at meetings, dinners, and networking events. But as I dug deeper into his investments, I discovered weaknesses, loopholes, unverified partnerships, and decisions made on impulse rather than reason. I crafted subtle exposures, sharing concerns with his associates, presenting them as friendly warnings from someone outside the immediate circle. No one suspected me, and yet the seeds of doubt began to grow. Within days, I noticed the first cracks. A business partner hesitated during negotiations. A friend who had always praised him questioned a recent investment. Daniel began to feel the tension in the room, the subtle shifts he couldn't understand. He blamed luck, coincidence, or paranoia. Little did he know, the architect of this pressure was sitting quietly at home, cataloging every reaction. Next came Eleanor. She had always thrived on control, manipulating Daniel and others with her sharp words and subtle intimidation. But now her own insecurities became her vulnerability. I began feeding information selectively, creating small, controlled exposures that made her question Daniel's loyalty and judgment. Every pointed remark she had ever made about me, every attempt to humiliate me became a tool I used to predict her actions, manipulate her expectations, and prepare her downfall. And Daniel's new partner, the woman he believed was perfect, became an unintentional ally. My careful conversations with her had planted doubt. She started noticing inconsistencies in Daniel's stories, subtle lies and omissions that hinted at his arrogance and manipulation. Slowly, she became cautious, hesitant, and even a little skeptical. I never forced her hand, but I nudged her gently, letting her see cracks in the man she had thought flawless. Meanwhile, I tightened my financial maneuvers. Every account I had access to, every legal loophole I had discovered became a subtle pressure point. I didn't act recklessly. Instead, I moved like a shadow, making imperceptible adjustments that gradually weakened Daniel's position without revealing my hand. Each small victory gave me confidence, reinforcing the truth I had discovered. Daniel had assumed he controlled everything. But control was an illusion he had built on arrogance and ignorance. And in that realization, I felt a surge of power unlike anything I had experienced. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about reclaiming my dignity, my control, and showing them that underestimating me had been their gravest mistake. Little did Daniel and Eleanor know, the next moves I was planning would not only expose their arrogance and financial carelessness, but also shake their social and personal world to the core. It was time to escalate. Weeks of careful observation, subtle manipulations, and quiet strategizing had led to this moment. Daniel and Eleanor had no idea I was about to strike in a way that would humiliate them publicly, dismantle their carefully curated reputation, and expose their arrogance for all to see. The perfect opportunity came at a high-profile charity gala, a glittering event Daniel loved to flaunt his wealth and influence at. He was certain his charm and social standing would dominate the evening.
unaware that I had orchestrated a series of quiet bombshells that would unravel him step by step. I arrived looking fragile and unassuming, the epitome of the grieving, powerless ex-wife. No one suspected the calculated storm that walked in with me. I had planted subtle information with mutual acquaintances and business partners in the weeks leading up to the event, enough to create quiet suspicions about Daniel's recent investments and decisions. Nothing could be traced back to me, but the ripple effect was already working. As the evening progressed, I observed carefully. Daniel's usual confidence began to falter in tiny, almost imperceptible ways. A partner hesitated before praising a project. A friend's glance lingered with doubt. And Eleanor's attempts to maintain control were faltering as she noticed reactions she couldn't predict. The cracks were appearing, and I was there to watch, quietly, without making a sound.
By the end of the gala, the ripple effect was clear.